All right, so here's the exercise. I just want you to take a moment, and think about the place you grew up. Remember the place you grew up. And you may still be living there. It may be a different community, but the place you grew up. And then think about what it was like when your grandparents were alive. What people who had been there for a long time told you it used to be like, right, when you were a child. So imagine what it was 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Imagine what it was like. And think about how different it was in the past. And now sort of move your visual image of that neighborhood or that community forward to the present. What is different now? What has changed between the past, when your grandparents were alive, and now in that community? What was the biggest change from the past to the present? And just think about that for a second. And you might want to write it down. And then my question to you is, if you had been researching back then, where would you have had to go to look to see the roots of that change, to see that change just beginning to emerge? So think about that for a second, and then you might want to pair up and sort of share your thoughts with each other for, I don't know, about 3 to 5 minutes. So the biggest change from like 20 or 30 years ago to the present in the place you grew up. And if you were a researcher back then, where would you have had to go to see the beginnings of that change starting to emerge? Okay, take 3 to 5 minutes and pair up. You can talk to each other about it, share. So what I'm going to talk about is some basic concepts and approaches to help you better spot that sort of change that might affect our futures in the here and now. So a lot of people talk about horizon scanning, which is also sometimes called environment scanning, in terms of radar, which is one way to think about it. You're trying to sweep. If you think about radar antennas circle constantly. So they sweep in a full circle. They sweep the entire horizon. They're looking for change everywhere, so that if you're on a ship, that the screen is displaying a picture of all of the territory around you, all of the ocean around you, and whatever coastline or islands there may be. I have had some colleagues say that rather than radar, we should think about sonar, which is, of course, the same kind of scanning, except it's much more three-dimensional because it covers, the entire depth of the ocean as well. So that's part of our job as futurists, is to attempt to be aware of change in every direction that it might arise. And sometimes people ask me, when they hear that I do futures research, if what I research is the future of technology, or they say, or do you research the future of economics, or do you look at politics, or is it social change that you're interested in? And I say yes, 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 and yes, because change comes from all of those places. Change erupts into our daily lives from value shifts and social shifts in social structures and changes in the economy and markets. And obviously, technological innovations drive a huge amount of change. Political shifts, political dynamics drive change. In the environment, as we are seeing, we both cause change the environment, and the environment changes us and our societies, our cultures, and our markets as well. So what we're interested in as futurists is change across all of those categories. You may have already learned to think in terms of what some people call an in English, the STEEP categories for social, technological, economic, environmental, and political. And that's just sort of a shorthand to remind us to look broadly across change, because the context of any question we ask about the future is dynamic change, systems of dynamic change. And possibly other people in this course will be talking to you about chaos theory and turbulence and change as turbulence and our responses to it as the responses of a complex adaptive system. I'm not going to go into that, but certainly every time we engage in futures research, we start off with a question or a problem or an issue or a decision. And that's usually in the context of an organization or a community, a smaller social group that has its own way usually of looking at the world. And frequently that organization is itself operating in a slightly larger context of a profession or a field or a market, or if you're a community, maybe a province or the context of a nation state. So that our question always has multiple frames that go out from the specifics of how do I solve the crisis in healthcare access, to I'm asking that question because I'm in a hospital, and my interest would be different if I were asking that question of solving healthcare crisis if I were in a public policy organization. So our organizational culture affects the question, affects how we do research. The profession or the market also colors our perception of our question and of where we go to look for information on that issue. So if I'm thinking about healthcare access and I'm an insurance company professional, I'm thinking about issues of healthcare access from a very different professional culture than if I were a community activist or a public health NGO worker who has very different priorities in asking that question, right? So one of the things that we always have to be aware of when we're first starting off on a piece of futures research is sort of what are our contexts, what are the biases and the cultural frameworks that affect how we even ask the question and where we go looking for change and where we go looking for data. What futures research brings to this is to say it's important to know how your organization is framing an issue and how that's different from how other organizations or professions might frame it. But there is a larger, much wider context out there, which is sort of life and reality as we know it. And in that much larger context, even if we think we've chosen a tight research focus, there will be changes coming in from demographics and from shifts in lifestyles and from new ways of framing social issues that emerge from artists and from people playing games and from technological innovations or from scientific discoveries, and potentially the actual environment and the ecology might change some of the aspects of that question. Public policy and politics will, economics will. So as futurists, what we are actually contributing more than any other kind of researcher is these broader contextual changes that people who are too focused on the specific data immediately surrounding a question like access to healthcare might almost have tunnel vision about that question because they are so embedded in how their organization views the situation. So we say you need to collect the specific data on the question, but you also should collect data about everything that's changing in its context that might have an impact on the specific question. And that's what horizon scanning does. It's just to go into a little kind of background detail. Some of the original horizon scanning was called environmental scanning, which meant like scanning the business environment. It didn't mean environment as in nature. And one of the first early uses of it was by Francis Aguilar at the Harvard Business School, and he wrote about it in a book, Scanning the Business Environment. Business sees it as basically an aspect of competitive intelligence, knowing what the market is doing, knowing what their suppliers are doing, what their competitors are doing. But true scanning is usually much broader than that, actually, much broader than the tight focus on the market and market competitors, excuse me, that competitive intelligence has. It's also related to issues management, which is that idea, as a friend said, it's sort of a fusion of public relations and future studies. In public policy, when an issue arises that has the potential to be politically controversial, issues management is essentially a field of study and a practice to manage the controversy enough that constructive public dialogue can take place. It tends to be much more focused on near-term issues and immediate public policy issues and plans to address them. But coming out of a lot of that early work is this idea of emerging issues analysis. And that essentially is the idea that every change has a life cycle. And Graham Molitor was one of the first people to sort of really express that in 1977. And basically said, before any major change occurs, there are people who are talking about it. Or in technology, there are people who are prototyping it. Or there are scientists who are discussing things, not necessarily in delivering formal papers at a scientific conference, but kind of talking in the hallways over coffee to their colleagues about some new interesting results that they've just run across. So the idea that that change bubbles up, and initially it may only be one or two cases of change or one or two people who are exploring a new political paradigm or a new mode of analysis, or in artists that are exploring a new artistic format, and that it becomes of interest to enough other people that more and more cases and more interest is created in that new idea, that new change, that new way of doing things, and it gets applied more and more often, it gets shared more and more often, which results in something that looks like this. So this is what I think of as sort of the core conceptual illustration of what it is that we do as futurists in tracking change. What happens in most systems, and especially in most government systems, is that governments frequently don't start addressing change and important issues until everybody's talking about them. They're widely understood. They're kind of deeply entrenched. They're creating a lot of problems, and governments have to do something about them, right? Policymakers have to deal with them. That's the point at which they normally engage with change. And that's essentially way up here at the top of this curve. What this curve represents is the idea that, as I said, initially with any change, there's sort of the first idea, or there are the first few people or first communities that are kind of trying a new way of doing things, or there's some new product that has been prototyped. And so the idea is that the origin point down here, sorry, let's see if I can do this. The origin point, nope, that's not it. Okay. There, I used to know where the pointer was. Where is the pointer? Spotlight. Okay, so the origin point down here is when a change is very local, or there are only a few cases, or it's an emerging scientific idea and only a few people are talking about it. So this, so over time, what happens is a change not only, if it is going to grow, It gets more dispersed geographically. It gets more dispersed through media. There are more cases of people applying it if it's a new way of doing things, or there are more people buying it if it's a new piece of technology. And there is enough data on the growth of change that we can start talking about it in terms of a trend. Because remember, a trend is a change in a variable over time. And in order to spot that a variable is changing, you have to have enough observation points of it. So, you know, we want to have more than 5 cases of, what would be a good example? More than 5 cases of restaurants offering meatless hamburgers. We want to see consumer purchases of several thousands, if not 10,000s, to say that yes, vegetarian hamburgers are becoming a new consumer value shift, right? So down here, where there are only a few cases, we can't talk about it in terms of trends. We can only talk about the change kind of in research terms from a case study approach. We have 3 or 4 or 5 or a dozen cases that we've noticed of this change being applied. And the whole point of horizon scanning is that you don't do it just once. It is an ongoing process. So from here on out, for the rest of your life, I want you to be doing horizon scanning, right? Looking for change. And when you spot something that you think is interesting, kind of keep track of it. Because not every change grows and gets bigger and bigger and becomes a successful product or becomes a significant new political philosophy, or goes from being sort of a fun fad that teenagers are engaging in to something that is an actual value shift throughout society. Some emerging changes fade away, they collapse, they evaporate. The ones we're interested in and the ones that we want to continue tracking are the ones that seem to be growing and growing and growing and growing. So up until the point where they are so pervasive that that it becomes clear what some of their unintended impacts are and where they're stressing the system, stressing system limits, and where problems are developing. Now, one way to track this, or to think about where those kinds of changes are discussed, is very, very local new changes are usually talked about among the few people that know about them. So in scientific communities, as I said, that may be a couple of people who know that they're working on the same topic and they get together and kind of have a coffee and discuss it at a scientific conference, but they haven't quite gotten to the point of a peer-reviewed paper yet. Maybe they'll blog about it, right? Artists might put on an exhibit or create a new art form. Radicals might be, in the old days, I'd say, create a newsletter that they'd, mimeograph, an old word, mimeograph, and distribute to, a very small mailing list. These days, even people with fairly radical ideas, or sort of mystics, new age prophets, people that are framing the world entirely differently, all have access to the web. And so they don't have to worry about having a mailing list anymore. They can kind of broadcast some of their fringe ideas. But as ideas or new technologies take hold, then we do start seeing people writing formal scientific articles about them in specialist journals, or analysts writing in-depth research and analysis on something and publishing it or sharing it in various ways, sharing it at conferences. And then up from that, magazines and documentaries start being made about them in a way, and those new ideas are expressed in ways that are more accessible to you and me. So essentially, change, in terms of where we can see change, it will move up a curve from only a few people know about it to specialized communities know about it and are talking about it, to it's entering broadcast media, and it's being talked about, or articles are written about it in newspapers and news magazines. And finally, sort of the last phase of that is institutions and government. Wow, I need to go faster. Okay. Sorry, I'm discovering the eternal how do I turn this off issue. Yeah, no, stop annotating. Okay. There we go. So another way to think about that is you can take that same curve and say, well, if I want to look at what the new normal is, and this is an example that is looking at military and defense issues. And if you wanted to do horizon scanning for military and defense issues, sort of how would you sort out the sources that you want to add to your list of publications or websites or people that you're going to monitor on a regular basis, right? Because that's what scanning is all about, is getting up every morning, reading the newspapers, looking at blog posts of interesting people, or the Twitter streams, the Twitter feeds of interesting people, compiling a list of sources that you can go back to on a regular basis for information about interesting new things that are bubbling up. And the more widely dispersed and different those sources are, the better your scanning will be. Start a Twitter, make a really interesting Twitter follow list. The more interesting the people are that you're following on Twitter, the more likely you are actually to get kind of early signals of change. And in this case, in the defense industry, we can talk about, at the height of a change's life cycle, when it's become matured, it's widespread, and it's become the new normal. In military terms, you'll see it being talked about in Defense News or the Diplomat or Jane's Defense Weekly. Down in the very early end of this, so down in the lower left-hand corner of this, what we think of as the foresight zone where we want to be operating, that includes monitoring art and fiction and fringe writings and slightly more esoteric journals. And in case of defense, it might be going to our colleagues in Futures Thinking at the Millennium Project, going to places like blogs and online journals like Ars Technica, the Atlantic Council Future Source. So the Foresight Zone, potential sources of change. You can also go to government organizations that are themselves doing horizon scanning, because there are a lot of organizations now that do horizon scanning, and a lot of them have websites. So they're putting their scanning data out for us. That's very handy. So Atlantic Council Future Source, armscontrolwalk.com, etc. So that's the foresight zone. Then as certain ideas start becoming more popular, they are in what my colleague Richard Lum of Vision Foresight Strategy calls the innovation early competition zone. So if it's a new product, it may have entered the market and be in competition with other similar products or innovations, or it may be a matter of, competing. The innovation early competition zone may be competition in the sense of two new paradigms or two new models of a way to do something are competing with each other to see which will win. And again, that may be, you may look for that sort of information in places like McKinsey, Popular Mechanics, Scientific American, Complexity Digest. Now, I have to stop for a moment. Obviously, there will be equivalents in every country of these sorts of journals and sources. So one of the assignments for you is to think, what would be the equivalents in Brazil of some of these examples that I have up here. And then after something becomes a little more embedded, it goes into the reactive zone where, and this is going to be important for an important thought for your exercise after this session, which is when something starts to look like it's really going to take hold as a change, The people who don't like it at that point start getting nervous and voicing their nervousness or voicing their opposition to the change. They react to it. People start talking about what impacts it's going to have. And so you start seeing that component of the issues or the changes maturing. Right, and it gets debated in the newspapers and in foreign policy, and nonprofit organizations start talking about impacts. So I'm hoping that this makes sense in as a way to think about the fact that not only do changes have life cycles from sort of the first idea that someone has or the first critical thought someone has to a full-blown social movement or full-blown market control of a new technology like, you know, the iPhone, and that information at the stages, on the stages of those life cycles of change can be found in different places. Okay. Now, I'm going to give you a few more quick hints on scanning outside the box. This is courtesy of a colleague named Lisa Bodell, who did a wonderful presentation on this. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly because then I want to get to another thought exercise, and I want to make sure I actually get through my slides this time, as opposed to, you know, last time. All right, so scanning outside the box. First of all, again, you want to think in terms of 360 degrees of change from everywhere, because you don't know where change might emerge, where the change that has the biggest impact on what you're interested in might emerge in the future. It could come from a value shift. It could be a new technology or a scientific discovery. It could be an environmental shift. You don't know. You have to keep your eye on the full spectrum of possible sources of change. So, and most of us have personal interests in things, right? I've always been interested in technological innovation, and I have to remind myself to look at policy shifts and look for new economic paradigms and economic models, right? So go beyond your own industry or field, diversify, get outside the limits of your own expertise. And one of the things that could just mean is find someone interesting in some other field of expertise and ask them a couple of questions about what they see as changing. Go global. So tap another worldview, ask people in other countries and other cultures what they see as changing, what's changing most dramatically where they are. All futurists must be good historians. History is the future. So think about the cycles and patterns of change, the patterns of how ideas or innovations matured in the past that can help you understand how those patterns might play out with some new change in the present, taking us to a different future. Do a Google search on health access 2040, right? On road transportation 2040, or 2050, or 2030, whatever, and see what Google finds. Because again, there are a lot of people engaged in futures research, and someone out there might already be exploring emerging change and how it affects your issue. You just need to go look. And on a related note, follow the futurists. This course is supported by the Millennium Project, and a lot of the people who have been talking to you have been either members of the Millennium Project or members of the Association of Professional Futurists. Professional futurists love talking to people and sharing ideas about change in the future. So get newsletters from them, follow them on Twitter, you know, send them an email and say, what do you think is changing with regard to health access? Could you you know, give me a little time and interview them. Look for the people who are in the center of your issue, who are most concerned with your issue. So since I'm using health access as an example, access to healthcare, you know, what are the organizations that are doing the most on that? What are they discussing? What do they think is changing? What are they most worried about for the future? Follow their blogs. What are they talking about? And again, contact them. Call people up and say, I've read it, your article was really interesting, and I'd like to hear a little bit more, particularly about what you think is changing or might transform the future. Be a customer. I kind of like this one, although it's obviously sort of expensive. I think of it as scanning by early adoption. So if one of the things you're interested in is a new technology or a new way of doing things, and there's a product for it or an application for it, and it's affordable, buy it and try it out. What is the customer experience like? How does it change your daily life? What does that mean for other people's daily lives? Create an advisory board for your project so that you can get regular input from them on what they see changing around them. Do a formal search at the patent office. Who's come up with new ideas that they're actually registering that might have an impact on your issue or your question? Then some of them are actually about our immediate environment and our immediate lived experience. So take a different route. Break your own path habits walking to work. Think about the little exercise you just did about thinking about how the community where you grew up has changed. If you were to walk through it now, what sort of emerging changes do you think you might see? You know, from week to week, what new things might you be able to spot just by walking through it, taking a different path than the one you normally take? Monitor your own ideas and your own insights about how things are changing. Keep an idea journal. Sign up for the newsletters of organizations related to your scanning issues. I've already talked about that. Look at unrelated industries, and this is the one that's hardest to get clients to understand. They think that they want to know and prioritize change that's emerging from markets that are familiar to them, or from changes with regard to suppliers or clients or employees or consumers that are immediately related to their product or their policy. And yet, as futurists and as systems thinkers, one of the things that we know is that the changes that are most surprising and therefore often the most disruptive are going to come in from the parts of reality that you haven't been paying attention to, which is again why we emphasize this 360-degree view. And finally, in the digital age, activate your toolbar. There are all kinds of really great ways to quickly tag incoming new data about how things are changing. So put favorite sources and blogs in your browser's toolbar. Create an RSS feed of some of the most interesting newsletters or journals that you like to monitor. There are a lot of ways to do that. There are actually some dedicated bits of software these days as well. Okay, so that's a very quick run through, and I want to do one more quick exercise. So again, just like the other one, only 3 minutes. So we'll be a little brutal at stopping you because, wow, I'm going to be running out of time. Do I get a few extra minutes because we started late, Rosa?
Yes, sure.
Okay, great. Okay, so the thought exercise here. So I had you do sort of a time travel journey into the past and compare the past with the present. At this point, I want you to think, well, what is the critical issue that interests you the most right now? And based on what I've just said, if you had to start building your bibliography, your list of scanning sources that you were regularly going to go look at, jot down three to five sources that you think would make interesting places to look for emerging change that might be relevant to your issue. So take a few minutes to jot down some ideas, and then again pair up or talk amongst yourselves and sort of share some of those sources. And make sure that you consider sources that might contribute some fringe thinking or some revolutionary disruptive thinking, and some marginalized voices. Some people who are kind of on the fringes and may have to think about the world differently. Okay, so 3 minutes. We're going to come back This next slide depicts the 3 horizons framework. Because time is tight, I will come back to this in the module tomorrow on action. The main thing that it represents now is that our life cycle of change, we kind of depict that life cycle of change as sort of one curve, but in actual fact, of course, we have multiple changes happening all the time, and they're happening at different rates. So what the 3 horizons framework helps us think about is that change actually occurs in overlapping waves, and its impacts also occur as overlapping waves. Our responses to it occur in overlapping waves. And that one of the other important things to think about with regards to change is that there are kind of 3 mindsets that there are 3 mindsets with regard to engaging with change. One of which is the managerial mindset, which is really about creating stability and maintaining systems as they are now. And that's not a bad thing. We need stability. We need stability in order to go about our daily lives and our daily work with some degree of security. So the managerial mindset can be useful, but it does tend to hold on to assumptions past, often past the point where they are fit for purpose. The visionary, on the other hand, is the person that immediately engages with new and transformative ideas and creates new and transformative ideas, but often is not very practical about actually implementing them. But we need the visionary because that's the creative, transformative force that helps us produce interesting and useful new changes. The entrepreneur is kind of in the middle, and it's the mindset that basically understands the systems of the past and understands what's still useful about them and where they're still viable, but also sees the creativity of the insights that the visionary is offering and asks the question, how do we bridge from the present, where some of our assumptions may be becoming outmoded and not as useful, to this visionary future in a way that actually works, in a way that's actually, effective and is realistic. So the key thing to remember here is again, this notion that change comes in overlapping waves. Some of those changes will be competing with each other, and they will all be creating impacts that also will be colliding, interacting with each other. So one of the other points that I want to make about horizon scanning is that it's different from the kinds of research that you're taught in traditional science research classes. So empirical and evidence-based research is usually focused on being credible, from credible sources that provide well-documented evidence, who are authoritative in their analysis, offer statistically significant evidence and data, are coherent in their data, that is, the data agrees with the argument that is being made, that are consensus-based. The experts also agree that that's what the data, that the data supports the argument, that are theoretically grounded, and that usually is monodisciplinary. Futures research, on the other hand, is the exact opposite of that, particularly horizon scanning. And I'm telling you this because horizon scanning data, you often have to deal with challenges from people that are heavily inhabiting that evidence-based mindset, empirical mindset. We're tracking emerging issues. There may only be 1 or 2 cases of them, and they may be emerging from insights or from sort of fringe thinkers who have come up with a radical new idea or a revolutionary new paradigm. So emerging issues often lack apparent credibility. They can be difficult to document because if you're really good and you've caught a change just as it's emerging, only 1 or 2 cases may yet exist. They often come from marginalized communities or outlier groups who are challenging the status quo. By definition, only 1 or 2 cases exist, which in statistical terms means that it's insignificant. At emergence, the data will vary widely. If you look at the early days of climate change, the climate change dialogue in the scientific community, the estimates of what kind of the degree of warming that might occur varied widely. And you could tell when the scientific community had gotten enough data and gotten enough surety because they started converging on their estimates of the impacts. Which leads us to the next point. Very often, emerging changes are challenges to established paradigms in other scientific fields. There's no consensus, there's argument. Sometimes the new idea is rejected because it is seen as a challenge to an established scientific model or paradigm. They often challenge previous theoretical structures and mean that scientists have to go through the effort of creating new theories. And quite frankly, the most interesting new changes are always going to emerge where disciplines and changes are clashing and converging. This is very much a post-disciplinary generalist's perspective. Okay, so just to warn you that that's the space you're inhabiting when you're doing horizon scanning and futures research. Very quickly, there are different ways of scanning. So the kinds of scanning that I was initially describing, where you're just looking for change everywhere, is characterized by Chun-Wei Chu, who's written some excellent articles on it, as touring, undirected viewing. You're not targeting a particular issue. This is what I think of as my daily ongoing scanning that I do every day as a futurist, just looking for change. Tracking is you've spotted something that might be interesting, and so you're following it. You're literally tracking it like you would, track a rabbit through the forest. Sense making to establish that something you think might be an emerging change is actually emerging. Satisficing is that idea if you don't want to invest huge amount of time in doing a deep dive, but you've got an issue that you want to investigate in a little more depth. So learning about an issue and then retrieving, which is when you've spotted an emerging change, you've tracked it, it really does seem to be emerging, maturing as a potentially significant change, and you do what some people call a deep dive or an intensive piece of research just on that change. So rough strategies for scanning. Then, how do you know that you've spotted something that's actually good? So useful scan hits that are close to that point of origin where there are only 1 or 2 cases that are early enough in their emergence as a change that we have time to act, that we have the possibility of creating policy leverage or social action to affect them, to manage them, or to take advantage of them, to see them as an opportunity. They're weak signals, often only 1 case. How do you validate that that's really something important? There are a couple of different ways to do it. First of all, confirmation. This is why scanning is an ongoing process. You need to accrue multiple citations. Remember I said that an emerging change, there might only be 1 or 2 cases. You have to keep an eye out to see if there are now 3 or 4 cases or 12 cases or 100 cases. You have to continue gathering the data to see if it in fact it is growing. Sometimes what you will discover is as you gather data, it fizzles out. It collapses as an emerging change. So confirmation, accruing multiple citations. Convergence. Again, that idea of initially a radical or revolutionary new idea or discovery or breakthrough or philosophical paradigm. There might be a lot of arguments about it and discussion about it, But if you see people coming to consensus, if you see a lot of scientists saying, yes, all our observations back up that this is what's happening, we are converging on this as a demonstrable, observable change, and we have insights about it, and the data supports those insights. Convergence, that tells you that you have spotted something true. And the other thing is get multiple perspectives. If people who are approaching the change from widely different cultures or business professions or academic disciplines are all seeing it as an emerging change, then that also is a validation that it probably is an emerging change. What underlines all of this is that scanning works better in teams or in groups of people. You know, you can sort of use your social media group as a team, as an informal team if you want. That's why I keep mentioning, you know, come up with an interesting Twitter feed. So, and I'm almost done. You'll be happy to know, yay, Rosa, I engineered this much better today. Yes, awesome. Okay, so that's basically kind of how you, the ideas that you keep in mind in the back of your head of, you know, have I actually found some things that do seem to be emerging as strong changes that could potentially have impacts that I want to think about, and that's where we'll end this. But first, how do you do this easily? Because one of the issues with scanning, again, is you're sorting through huge amounts of data. I mean, seriously, I probably spend 2 hours a day reading things from various sources as my daily keeping up with change in the world, just because I'm a futurist, not entirely aside from projects that I work on, just sort of keeping up with things. And our grad students at the University of Houston sometimes refer to scanning as trying to drink from a fire hose, right? Massive volumes of material, and you're trying to sort through it, which is another reason why it's good to have a team. And the great thing for you guys is that you are doing this in the era of, in the digital age, in the era of social media platforms. So there are actually things that can make this easier for you. And I mentioned set up an RSS feed, a Google RSS feed on certain topics or certain areas. You can, you know, I look for interesting people on Twitter to follow. And my great story about that is that there's an actor called Nathan Fillion, who those of you who are science fiction fanatics might remember as playing, oh God, I don't remember what his character's name was, the captain of the spaceship Serenity on the in the TV show Firefly. And I followed him because he's funny, right? But he actually tried out this amazing little piece of transport kit and tweeted about it. And I was talking, and I kind of mentioned it to a client as part of a conversation we were having about other scanning. And that was the scan hit that the client was actually most interested in. So you never know who's going to be a great source. So again, diversity of sources is good, and you can build that diversity very easy in your Twitter feed. And to some extent in your Facebook feed, but really Twitter is better set up to do that. Another way to do this is, I know people think of Pinterest as a place where, I don't know, people collect recipes and things about crafts, and I don't know what all people do with Pinterest, but Pinterest is a way of pinning citations and having conversations about them. So you could easily set up a Pinterest-based scanning team platform, and it's free. There's another platform called Pearl Trees. Same thing. It is more specifically focused on doing scanning. I have a friend who does all of her scanning, saves all of her scanning into Pearl Trees. The other thing is that with regard to setting up your browser, go to www.stumbleupon.com and sign up for it. Choose a number of interests, and it will feed you interesting articles across a whole variety of topics. And the great thing about it is that all all of the things that it will send your way have been basically curated by the other people who are on StumbleUpon because they've rated it highly. So the crowd is kind of curating things as interesting. And you can choose StumbleUpon when you first sign up for it. You choose a variety of topics. So it can be everything from technological innovation to crochet. But you can choose topics that you think might be interesting, might make an interesting array for your scanning effort, and it will start feeding you websites and articles and anything that it can link to. And it will also ask you to rate how interesting they were. So it knows whether to kind of keep passing those articles on as curation. There are also some really purpose-built foresight platforms. Most of these are fairly expensive. Some of them are seriously expensive. The one that may be the best known, because it really was purpose-built for future studies, is Shaping Tomorrow. And it's at a certain sort of basic level. I think access to Shaping Tomorrow, parts of Shaping Tomorrow, are free. And I won't go into great detail on the rest of these but the key takeaway here is that if you're starting off scanning just by yourself, there are social media platforms that are free that you can use just to get your scanning started. If you are actually building a giant government or business foresight project and there's money available, then there are purpose-built scanning platforms and foresight platforms that would add greatly to the sophistication of your research project. Let's put it that way. Okay, so yay, I am nearly done. So you've collected all this data, and you have got, you have now got the world's most interesting selection of weird facts to share over coffee and at cocktail party. The question we get most often from clients is they'll read through a scanning report and they'll go, wow, this is just really interesting. Really interesting. And then so what? And that's the part where all of the rest of futures research tools and methods kicks in. We have to help them answer the so what question. And there are two great initial responses to that. One I have a few slides on, the other I didn't because I figured rightly that I'd run out of time. So one of those techniques is something called cross-impact analysis, where you ask yourself, what if, so we now have electric cars, but they're hard to charge. Oh, but someone has now invented inductive charging, where you can just, drop your iPhone on a little inductive charging plate and it charges. Oh, and someone else is floating the idea of solar roadways, where we just build solar collections, solar photovoltaic cells into roads because they are giant flat surfaces that absorb the sun. So what does the cross impact look like where you're doing all of those three things? Well, if you built solar roadways with inductive charging circuits into them, and you had electric cars that could inductively charge, then you wouldn't have to worry about recharging them because they would just be recharging the entire time you were driving down the highway. So cross-impact analysis, looking at how changes interact with each other in ways that where they either are accelerating or amplifying each other, or they're constraining each other. And there's a whole huge literature on doing that. It also relates to kind of system mapping, how changes interconnect. But having said that, what I think is one of the best, easiest, most fun, most creative, highly strategic tools that futures researchers have to answer the so what question is Futures Wheels. And the great news is, after I stop talking, you are this afternoon going to be doing a Futures Wheel exercise. So I'm not going to go into great depth, but the basic concept of a Futures Wheel is that it maps impact cascades from a single emerging change. So you just need basic change data, you need good imaginations, You need to kind of set yourself free to be creative. The person who invented it is Jerome Glenn, whom you all know from the Millennium Project. He invented it in 1971. It's also been called implementation wheels, impact wheels, mind mapping, and webbing. Joel Barker, and Joel and Jerome have had some interesting conflicts about this. Joel Barker has done an awful lot of consulting work on this. He refers to it usually as cascade thinking. Part of the reason I'm including him on this slide is that he has, again, for those of you that can spend money on this, has iWheel software that actually helps you make the futures wheels, make very complex futures wheels sort of using software. An example of one that I did with a client actually was about 10 years ago now, looking at pervasive computing and what that might mean in terms of health and safety at the workplace. Not only, you know, looked at everything from increases in social divide to increased radiation impacts, increased monitoring that caused increased stress, to which there'd be a backlash, increased monitoring that caused increased safety, including parental monitoring of child safety. So again, the idea is that you take a change and you say, let's assume this change has matured and it's beginning to have impacts. What would be the most immediate impacts? Okay, so we have a ring of the most immediate impacts. And then you start looking at those and saying, well, they themselves become change. What are their impacts? So that you follow the cascades of impacts out to ever more surprising outcomes. Now, last slide, you'll be happy to note, and it's the instructions, so I'm not going to go into detail. I am going to say one thing: be specific. Don't say, oh, well, everyone having smartphones could potentially really change education. Don't tell me that it's going to change education. Tell me how. When you're doing your futures wheels, the best rule of thumb I could give you is to say, be specific in terms of daily life. How will it change how we live? You know, will I be brushing my teeth differently? Will I be doing homework assignments differently? Will I not have to be in school because I can teleconference with my instructors, even as a third grader? Right. So be specific and allow yourself to have a good time with it. If everyone is laughing while you're doing futures wheels, you're probably doing them right.